Welcome back to Founding Footprints, a podcast sponsored by the Virginia 250 Commission in partnership with the Charlottesville Albemarle Convention and Visitors Bureau, the CACVB. The CACVB has developed thematic itineraries to pair with each episode. See what they've developed for this episode at visitcharlottesville.org. I'm Ben Bernard, historian at the University of Virginia. On Founding Footprints, we've had a few episodes so far about food and drink, in part because they really hit that intersection of the history of life here in Charlottesville and Albemarle County with contemporary tourism. So we wanted to get to know a food historian who has been working to develop a life practice around critical thought about foodways, as well as expertise in food history in the region. And Leni Sorensen is a real local character figure, an amazing person that I would love for you all to meet. You can learn more about her in a 2022 New York Times profile titled Food Scholar, Folk Singer, Blunt Speaker, The Many Lives of Leni Sorensen. And you can hear her in the Netflix docuseries High on the Hog, How African American Cuisine Transformed America. Here's my conversation with Leni Sorensen.
I'm Leni Sorensen. I hold a doctorate in African American history and culture from William & Mary. I'm a food historian. I am particularly interested in American foodways and how they impact all of us. I love to cook, I love to teach, and I'm writing a book. Tentatively, the title is Every Damn Day, which has to do with home provisioning and people thinking seriously about how to have sufficient foodstuffs in their pantries for food security, given the kind of circumstances that have been happening certainly in the last, decade, but certainly in the last 5 years.
So it's a very contemporary book.
Yes, and it's written for people who might live on the 16th floor, in an apartment building in wherever, Philly, New York, all the way to, people who live on 5 acres, somewhere, or proto-farmers or whoever. But it's kind of tied into the idea that an awful lot of people, even food producers, which really drives me crazy, often don't have more than 3 or 4 days at the very most worth of food in their house. So when they lose their job, they break their leg, the COVID happens, blah, 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 they're because they're having pitched battles in the aisles at Kroger, over a roll of toilet paper or a can of beans or something.
It sounds like a project that's very much inspired by the events of the last 5 years. Is the kind of provisioning that you're describing, how does that differ from, on a granular level, how and what people ate in Albemarle County and Charlottesville around 1800?
Albemarle and Charlottesville were almost non-existent in terms of size. I mean, the county was big, but it was all rural, ringed by some great, some big plantation houses, but a significant population were freed blacks, certainly a goodly number of enslaved people, as the university began its building and doing and all. And they lived in a world that was rural. Every bit of food had to be processed in some way. It had to be. And you can really then see the difference between the elites and the lesser, and certainly the very poor, by the kind of diets they had.
What distinguishes those diets?
Almost always the amounts of meat, certainly vast amounts of alcohol, imported items, lemons, vanilla, nutmeg. Whenever you see that, whenever you see a mention of an ice house, sometimes when we look at the past, we have to remember not only when and who, but what was the climate, at what latitude did people live, in terms of what kind of foodstuffs they could grow.
And certainly, of course, I think we have to ask about different types of people. It depends so much on who you are.
Yeah, who people. Yeah, who people, what people. Maybe because we've become so homogenized because of technology, because of the ability to bring California lettuce and Minnesota apples and Florida oranges and, cranberries from Maine. We haven't continued to really look at the diversity of climates and regions. And so it's easy to construct, as we have over the last, certainly the last 25, 30 years, this explosion of food myths. People get into that, well, my grandma, this and that. Well, you have to ask, how old are you? Well, your grandma wasn't born until 1965. So, what would she know? And her mother was born in 1942, in the middle of World War II, and her grandmother was born in 1905. So all of your, 5 generations of your family have been born during technology. So to, hearken with this really longing to some mythic past is sometimes both sad and hard to deal with.
What are some of the common dishes, the common foods that you think really characterize the years around 1800 in this region?
Poorer people would have been eating a great deal of cornmeal mush, corn harmony, because that was just a really common thing. They would have grown gardens in which, hopefully, they could have grown sweet potatoes, pumpkins, white potatoes, onions, beetroot, carrots that could see them through the winter months. That could be and cabbages, those kinds of things, without having to be cut up and processed. In other words, they could be buried, they could be stored, underground or whatever. Now, the very, very poor just ate very poorly. Very narrow, limited diets, and especially the enslaved, unless they had the freedom of time, which, of course, was directly related to the kind of master class that they were working for, that they were enslaved by, of how much gardens could they have. And we know from some records at Monticello that some people, at least in that circumstance, were immensely prolific when it came to garden truck. You get up to the next level of people who own land but are really lower middling farmers. Well, they almost always have slave labor. Even if they don't own slaves, they hire slave labor. So they've got extra labor. And at a time when everything has to be done by hand, every fire, every water, every ashes, every wood, that all takes human energy. If you don't have that energy in your family setting, your diet is going to be correspondingly narrow because you just only have so much energy to do so much. And you've still got to produce some kind of major crop that you can sell so that you can sustain yourself, but also pay your taxes. They're not accepting corn for taxes. You got to pay money for taxes. The elite are eating meat and wheat and spices and other things created in kitchens that are staffed by skilled black cooks.
Tell me about these figures.
They start as scullions in kitchens, and they're slowly trained at the side of a cook. So depending on the skill of the house mistress, the cooks are more or less encouraged to use their skills fully, because if you have a 22-year-old young house mistress and you've got a 45-year-old cook who's been cooking for 20 years, who knows about the food? Well, the cook knows about the food, and so they're learning, they're apprenticing, and we certainly know in the case of Monticello, we have a number of people who are in positions to be trained and learning with French chefs. So they're learning a particular kind of cookery that was well admired by Jefferson, that he had served at his table. Mary Randolph, who was a relative of his by marriage, her cookbook was immensely popular in the 19th century, but it was first published in 1824. Now, but it reflected essentially her 3 decades of interest in and production of and supervision of dining at her various tables. It's quite clear all of her cooks knew what was in that book. Some may have been literate, we don't know. But cooks retain an enormous array of foods.
This is a volume called The Virginia Housewife or Methodical Cook by Mary Randolph. It's a kind of hybrid cookbook and household management guide. It's part of a genre of texts that consider cooking as part of the task of managing a household that extends from provisioning through recipes. And she also had several different family connections to the Jefferson family. Her own brother married Martha Jefferson, who was Thomas Jefferson's daughter. And so Mary Randolph's book really emerges from the same kind of society or civilization as Jefferson. I'm curious what your favorite sources are about food during this period.
Well, I've looked through a few of these books, the names of which right now, they're all in French, and I can't remember the names of them. And there's not that many of them. What I'm more struck by in terms of the 18th century is I see it as a transition from late medieval Renaissance, I guess we might want to use, tastes in food. But in those transitions of taste, we see a movement from meats among the elites almost always having that ancient sweet, very spicy with sweet spices and raisins and candied fruit mixed with savory in a way that, other than mincemeat, we just no longer find attractive in most Western cooking. Now, I do understand, my son worked in a Moroccan restaurant for a while. In that certain kind of Middle Eastern food, we still see echoes of it. And it can be very lovely, but I have a feeling that it's less intense than how it would have been 300 years ago, 250 years ago. That's my sense. That's just my sense.
There's an interpretive problem about using cookbooks from this period. So how do you recreate a historic recipe to make a dish that's both authentic and something that people today would actually want to eat?
Well, I think cooks who have done that, historic cooks. I know there are people in Europe who specialize in that kind of cookery, people in our country who really do early 18th century foodways from the northeast part of the country. And, I mean, much of it just sounds really god-awful. Some of that, I think, as we've changed over, as we come into the beginnings of the scientific era, which is really, immediately post-Newton, the idea that we can quantify stuff and we can begin to look at things more closely. So they didn't know about calories. They didn't know how the body consumed whatever. And so there were many kinds of ailments and conditions for which specific foods were recommended that, we now know have absolutely nothing to do with illness or whatever. So in the late 18th century, even, early 19th century, while Mary Randolph does not impute kind of beneficials to this or that bodily function, when she's referring to her food, she's given recipes. And actually coherent recipes, not quite laid out the way we do today with all the ingredients in a row and like that. But she's very detailed in her descriptions. She does come up with, when you read, if you start reading it, very helpful, clear, thought out preparations of food and storage of foods that it's clear is becoming part of how people are dealing with food. They're thinking about making cordials, jams, jellies, preserving things, how to salt things down, how to make sure that there's enough of the foodstuffs. And so it's all seasonal, but it's seasonal in the way that if you're going to have raspberry cordial, available to make something in November. You have to have done that during raspberry season, which here in Virginia tends to be June. Okay, so the cooks are always both working on today's dinner, because there's a dinner every single day, but they're working ahead on the ham that's going to be boiled for tomorrow, the next day, the raspberries that are going to be processed today that could be used all the way through November.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of people have a kind of mythic idea about food in the past. And what I'm hearing is that, it's not necessarily the case that food was healthier in 1800 or that it tasted better. Like they didn't know about calories. It depends who you are, right?
Right. I mean, if you consider how much food is wasted today and lost today, and they say something like an ungodly amount, 40% of the food that's produced. But at the time, too, they lost food to rodents, to parasites, to bad weather, to poor storage, to contamination, because people were always trying to make a buck, so they were always contaminating the milk, trying to make it look whiter. They were caught for contaminating the bread, and they had to keep making laws. It's clear that particularly in urban settings, people are very poorly nourished, certainly the working class, the poor, because they are often being sold contaminated food in various ways. So when Napoleon sets this award, and Appert, who's been working on, he's a confectioner, I believe, was his original occupation. He comes up with the idea, well, you could put things in jars and you seal the jar, and then you boil it for an adequate amount of time. You will have food that a month later is still good. I mean, it was marvelous, and he won the prize. So the 19th century is this interesting progression, but there's things they don't know. They're just beginning to really make a lot of cornmeal and ship it, and they learn that if you take the germ out of it, well, it holds better. It doesn't get spoiled, and you can send it all the way to Illinois. You can send it to Portland. But, of course, it now lacks its vitamins, and people are getting pellagra, which is a killer. And 200,000 people a year are dying from pellagra, especially those whose diets are primarily what they call the 3 M's, meat, meal, and molasses. So we have those transitions. So there are many layers, and one could spend a dissertation on any one of those layers and have a very rich, discourse about it.
You are deeply engaged in the practice of provisioning in your own house. Can you tell me a little bit about what your kitchen at Indigo House looks like if we were to walk in and open the pantry door?
Well, I actually have several pantries. I've got several freezers because I'm a food hoarder. I admit it. But I'm also the center hub for 3 family members who are all householders. So they come and kind of shop at Mom's house. I end up with a lot of canned goods, partly because I cook. I teach canning, and so there's always stuff left over. But I also love doing it, and it's a way of having shelf-stable foods that I can share with other people. I can use anytime. If the power goes out, I got lots of food that I could eat.
I understand you also host themed dinners.
So I've had these dinners that are history-themed dinners that really emphasize, of course, Black cooks, because they all have a somewhat Southern, bent to them. And these are women and some men who I really, really want to bring to people's attention, and I want to honor them. But the foods themselves are often just wonderful foods, to be able to have fun to cook something.
You might be associated with macaroni and cheese. I understand that you participated in a Netflix documentary, High on the Hog, about African-American historic foodways. Can you tell me about macaroni and cheese and your contribution to this story?
I'm pretty sure that James Heming, who, of course, he died in 1801. We have to keep remembering that. would have experienced a French or versions of using macaroni and putting cheese with it. It wasn't so, he didn't invent it. It was something that was out there, and thus we know that when we see in Jefferson's housekeeping books that he's buying 65 pounds of macaroni imported 6 months before he dies, that clearly this dish is a favorite in a household that often is 14, 15, 16 people regularly every single day. So it's being served because it is delicious and it's a nice made dish that goes well with many other kinds of foods and is really popular.
That's great. And of course, we can't not think about the tie-in with Yankee Doodle, this kind of amazing reclaimed slur.
It's interesting to go back to see, you can easily see that the word macaroni was something that was of a European, well, I think it was probably an English slur on the Italians. Anything that was bad or weird or unusual, you could blame it on the other culture because they tended to, along with all this weird food and body stuff, they tended to think of nationalities as races of people. Remember, it isn't until 1920 that the Irish get to be white.
In the field of gender studies in the 18th century, in the Age of Revolutions, there's been a kind of reinterpretation of Yankee Doodle where it's a kind of artistic caricature of the effeminate dandy, the kind of effete colonist who's taking on the pretensions of urbane Europeans as a kind of particularly queer mode of...
We almost always tend to make fun of dandies. People who, for whatever reason, from wherever we're standing, appear to be dandies, whatever that means, you know what I mean, to be. And it's almost always the young and the seeming kind of pretentious. I am the model of a modern major general.
This cultural connection between food and fashion and politics is really stunning. Going back to what we were just discussing about the casserole dish macaroni itself, and your participation in this Netflix documentary.
Absolutely.
Is there a difference between African American foodways, Southern food, and soul food? How are these terms different?
Oh, boy, that's a dissertation. In many ways, they just overlap and convolute and rotate and mix and do. And people love to have names for things, and I am not going to judge people's decision that this is this and this is that. But that obviously, those Southern foods that we come to think of as emblematic of country food and then emblematic of soul food, which is a word, a term that doesn't really come into use until the early 1960s, are all very Southern. Well, then when we consider who's cooking in the South, well, obviously, many, many, many black people, black men and black women. And we also have lower, middling, and white people who are growing the same things. They're all eating collard greens too, and corn pone and cornbread. They might have a few additional things, but they're all mixed because they're all living together. They're all farming in the same land.
We were talking earlier about some of the black chefs who rose to prominence in elite households, such as Thomas Jefferson's household at Monticello. Is there any kind of feedback loop happening where maybe the chefs in a rich household are bringing in African-American cuisine into the kitchens of the landed gentry, or the arrow going in the opposite direction of some of these very kind of specialized, formally trained chefs who kind of come through their apprenticeships, having an impact on the cuisine and foodways in African-American communities more broadly?
I think it's happening both ways. Okra is mentioned as early, and I believe the figure that I have is in the Caribbean. The English had enclaves there, and there were African and Afro-Virginians, and not Virginians, Afro-Caribbeans there, eating okra early in the 18th century. And so by the time it gets to Virginia, it's not something brand new. Everybody's eating it. And so there's just these traditions of, is the food good? Then yes, we'll eat it. It's that. And people come with different, cooks came with different abilities earlier from the Caribbean, and then later people who were just born here. By the time you get to Edith and Francis, they're fourth generation American born people. They're not strangers. There's not some cutoff date that we can say. They are incorporating what their mother taught them, what their sister taught them, what that uncle taught them. So when you look at, say, somebody like Edna Lewis, and if you read thoroughly her Taste of Country Cooking, you're seeing a mid-20th century homage to that mixture, because it's a mixture of everything that's beautiful about Virginia cuisine. And so much of it was prepared by black hands that one cannot help but assume that those hands knew what they were doing. Those hands were connected to heads, and the heads knew what the hands were doing. And so we can't always make these, I'm not much for competition or judgment. Who did it first? I don't care who did it first. Are we doing it? Then that's cool to me. I don't like food contests other than the British baking show. I don't want food to be frenzied. I want food to be lovely and welcoming, and let's all sit at the table and eat until we can't move and laugh until we can't laugh anymore. That's what I want food to be.
The occasion of this podcast is for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and to celebrate that semi-quincentennial anniversary of the American Revolution. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on how food and the perspective of everything that encompasses can help us think through the meaning of this anniversary.
Well, I don't think there's a celebration out there that doesn't involve food. You're going to get a whole bunch of folks together. Someone's going to get hungry, and someone's got to feed them. And so no matter whether it's, somebody goes out and gets some chicken hot dogs, or somebody puts a half a pig on a spit, or somebody, pulls out a grill, or somebody makes a pot of beans, or somebody makes, 150 tamales. And, all celebrations. It seems to me within human societies, everything that you read about, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's wherever, if there's going to be a celebration, there's going to be some food. And all of that food, whether it's for a homecoming or a funeral or a wedding, is almost always the best that the group can muster, whatever that group might be, and no matter how impoverished they might be or how elite they might be, they want to have it be the best food.
I think Sage and I both want to know, what do you cook on the 4th of July?
I don't usually celebrate the 4th of July, to tell you the truth. I'm 83 years old. I've had so damn many 4th of Julys and Christmas and all that. I'm not a holiday person. My mother just hated holidays, so I didn't grow up with a big tradition of holidays. I'm likely to make, something really fantastic just because it's Thursday, and I feel like it. Now, there have been 4th of Julys that I've made, just your standard hamburgers, really great hot dogs, homemade hamburger buns. I make a pretty good potato salad, all the traditional stuff. And I've kind of put it all out there to see how, how close can I get to what seems to be the traditional. But I'm as likely to make that, if it's the season, then I make it.
I love that idea of, recovering a quality of food in the everyday, even if it comes at the expense of these holidays. Leni Sorensen, I've heard about the Virginia Humanities Folk Life Apprenticeship Program. Could you tell me a little bit about what this program entails?
My assistant Liz Beeman and I were awarded a grant for teaching traditional Virginia foodways, and so Elizabeth has canned food. She's prepared again these 200-year-old recipes from Mary Randolph, and she will be doing a personal stint at the Folklife Festival in Washington in July that I'm so proud that she's going to go and bang it out, give them a really neat demonstration. And so that's it's something that Virginia needs to be and continues to be very, very proud of. It's wonderful.
It sounds like it's part of the kind of intangible patrimony of the region.
Yes, it's recognizing that this is an area. First of all, so many people have come to Virginia, people from so many places, and they bring with them their cultural riches. And so to have an opportunity to share those riches with people who might come from a totally other setting is amazing. That's how we transmit culture.
Leni Sorensen, thank you so much for coming in to speak with me today. I've learned so much, and it's wonderful to hear about your varied interests.
Founding Footprints is a VA 250 project, America, made in Virginia. This podcast is a production of the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM. Hosted by Dr. Benjamin Bernard with sound design by Sage Tanguay, editing by Coco On, and music provided by Blue Dot Sessions. If you'd like to explore the history of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, you can find more information at visitcharlottesville.org. Virginia is for history lovers.